Hi guys, George Troglodyne here with another video, sort of on the subject of corporate and all that sort of stuff. Really, a lot of the reasons why many of the videos on this channel are about weird things that happen with your career and corporate and stuff like that is just, I've had a lot of weird things happen to me with regard to uh, it just doesn't make any sense with regard to why did management make one decision or another. And they never really explain themselves because, to be quite frank, they don't actually have an explanation for themselves. They're not really doing things at a conscious level there that would explain why they actually do what they do because they don't really understand why things are the way they are. At least very few of them understand why things are the way they are. And the only organizations where people actually do tend to understand why things are the way they are organizations which are already very, very, very deeply into this sort of pathology I'm going to describe here today, and that in the free market would be so diseased that they couldn't work as a firm anymore. I'm talking about organizations here like the Army, which is pretty much the poster child for this kind of disease, which sort of a lot of the stuff that got me into this was a good article by a former Army guy who does real estate investing and things like that nowadays and writes books, all that kind of stuff. But his article was basically called advancement in the Army is a single elimination ass kissing tournament. Okay. And that got me to read a few more books, look into, more about, well, why is it this way? I mean, it's obvious that it's this way, that essentially the way to advance in corporate is to never rock any boat, which the only real way you can actually never rock any boat and always succeed at your objectives and things like that is to be the most mediocre person you can possibly imagine with no opinions whatsoever of your own. And essentially it's the NPC meme, right? Where it's this person has nothing going on inside their head at all. And so eventually you end up with an organization that their entire leadership is essentially just stuffing their head with old rags. And well, this is why you get these sort of totally irrational outcomes because uh, basically all they're doing is being a massive filter against what it takes to actually be productive. And a lot of that has to do with the aging life cycle of a company. This is sort of why almost every organization goes this way, given enough time. And the sort of hack that people embraced to scale organizations without actually diluting their ownership, which I'll get into here in a bit. Uh, but the biggest thing that I have to say is, how is it that these organizations that they just keep making these ridiculous, irrational decisions with regard to their workers and what they work on and their sort of irrationally low risk tolerance? How is it that they actually survive so long in the market? I mean, there's some of them like the Army, obviously, that the reason they survive so long is because there is an endless, vortex, $4 trillion, taxpayer money, corruption kind of stuff. But when it comes to things like firms in the market, the reason that they actually stick around so long is because basically after the firm passed Dunbar's number and stuff, you're always going to get these sort of pathologies eventually infiltrate the company, if only for the reason that we have so much regulatory on firms nowadays that it's going to infest you with regulatory compliance people. Okay. And if you're familiar at all with regulatory, that's the mindset there is the sort of, it's not the lust for gain mindset. It is absolutely the fear of loss mindset. Everybody is basically totally inoculated against taking any risks whatsoever, right? And so eventually you're going to get a department in your company, usually HR and legal, right, that is promulgating these sort of risk attitudes, and they eventually seep out into the entire company and into the entire management because they're basically talking directly to management all the time, unlike a lot of the workers who their opinions are essentially not heard at all. while these are the things that are, tugging the ears of the management nonstop because, it's regulatory compliance, it's illegal. Those things are huge threats to the business, right? So, anyways, when you play not to lose, on the other hand, uh, that's going to keep your firm around a long time, but it will not grow your firm. I've seen a lot of businesses like this, very mature businesses, that they've captured a lot of the market, but they seem to be butting their heads up against a brick wall of incapability of acquiring new customers, modifying their product to fit new markets, things like that. And a lot of that really has to do with they're just really really afraid of rocking the boat, and thus turning off their existing customers. When the fact is, you can always put out experimental versions of things. You can always put out little plugins that are optional. There's ways you can design products that won't turn off your existing customer base. No, this sort of risk intolerance is essentially irrational, and it's really just 100% having to do with an attitudinal problem. And that's just because that's what it takes to get ahead in management, is this sort of nothing ever goes wrong and therefore I should be promoted, which it's like, no, actually nothing going wrong means you're never taking any risks and you probably should be fired, right? uh, but that's how it works. When you're playing not to lose, you can't make mistakes, which means any person who takes a risk that might have a huge reward, even if they have 2 or 3 successes at the start, they're eventually going to get their head chopped off because they took one that didn't work out, right? So why is it that it sort of has to become this way? That's sort of what I want to get to, and I've got a lot of notes here, so you'll have to forgive me. Basically, the hack that was sort of instituted way back in the years of yore, we're talking 1800s here, that was used to allow organizations to scale to the point that they are right now, where we've got lots of shareholders, firms are even international, stuff like that. The fact is that everybody really got scared of being sued. And this was a huge problem back in the day, that basically all of the directors of a company were all personally liable, and severally, you name it, right? Everything that any agent of the company did was actually the fault of the owners, right? And so no matter how crazy or stupid their particular employee was, it was their fault, right? And when you scale an organization past, like I said, Dunbar's number, which is essentially the how many people can you fit in your head and actually personally know, that means that you're going to have to delegate stuff to someone you trust. And well, how far do you trust them, right? And at some point, you're going to run out of people who are simpatico in your mind, right? That you can actually trust. And eventually, with enough time, there's going to be changes in upper management. There's going to be lots and lots of churn that makes it a practical impossibility to have such a tight control over the stock of employees that you're pretty sure they're not going to do something, real bad. You're going to get some slip through, right? So what they decided to do was make this thing called the corporate veil, which previously it was only extended to sort of public service projects like building a road, something like that. That was sort of a semi-public private partnership kind of thing, so that things that the voters and the public and so forth considered was in their interest could get done, and that it could be done reasonably straightforwardly. And so they extended this concept even to the private sector, acting like John Q. Public, sort of corporation running for profit rather than sort of a not-for-profit enterprise, which is what most of them were before. Uh, Now they also got the benefit of the corporate veil. And so this is essentially a big hack to extend the size of a firm and to scale a business, but without actually having to dilute the ownership, right? Good coffee. Anyways, so we've got the firm now starting to get to a scale that it couldn't be before, right? And the question is, why exactly does this actually result in this sort of incapacity to take risks in a sane manner? Well, it turns out that now that the directors of the firm and the owners of the firm are no longer actually in control of the firm, they're not on the hook for the firm. The question is, are they really still in control? Well, all they really do now is they appoint agents, right? They say, well, you're the guy who's going to be in charge, you're going to be making the decisions, and I can replace you if you make a decision I don't like, right? So they no longer are directly in control of the firm. That was sort of the price for the hack. But sometimes they appoint themselves, and then you sort of destroyed the usefulness of the hack, and companies get into trouble doing that sometimes. But most of the time they don't, because they know better, and especially if they've got a large shareholder pool, it's simply impractical. So, anyways, when we're talking about this sort of firm, uh, you have to understand that the motivations of the agents, right? This is sort of where the principal agent problem comes into play, because again, like I said, you can trust some people, but once an organization gets to a certain scale, you've got to have, essentially, they can't have more direct reports than they can actually fit inside their head. And most people have a social life, so that means there's going to be a smaller number of people they can sort of fit inside their head in the firm. So, I mean, you very quickly get a branching tree of relationships between people in a firm, and it's probably the biggest you can actually get away with is something like 20 people or so, based on how many that they can practically know and actually keep a handle on reasonably well, just because that most people have a social life outside the firm. That's how many people they can deal with, yada 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 yada, right? So anyways, the reason this results in this weirdness is because the agents, they sort of realize they're getting a raw deal here, right? Because now they're on the hook, but they're not really getting the benefits of actually being in control. So a lot of people, they have cognitive dissonance. They have sort of a resentment of having all the responsibility for something, but none of the real control or benefits for having that responsibility for something, right? So in the corporate situation, you have all the benefits essentially are flowing to the management, the stockholders, right? At least in theory, right? And then you have the agents who have the actual responsibility. It kind of sounds like a raw deal at first, doesn't it? Well, this is why we end up getting firms that they reward their executives with ridiculous compensation packages, essentially eat almost all of the profits of the firm rather than rewarding them to the shareholders who, by law are entitled to it, right? You hope you have a return on your investment. And essentially, what modern management in general you'll find does is they manage to consume, very conveniently, mind you, all of the surplus profit required to get the cap rate for the shareholders, essentially at whatever is the market rate. So that's going to be 6-7% a year or something like that. And on the meantime, they just keep the rest for themselves, and they're relying on just the numbers these days rather than actually doing a dividend and having a real cap rate and having a real yield. They're just relying on their sales numbers, things like that, to actually bring their firm's valuation up, 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 up to the roof, right? And so you can't actually end up having a firm that takes proper risks with this sort of thing. And here's why. Because they naturally see this sort of immunity that the people above them have, and they want it too, right? And so what they've done, and this is largely unconscious, is actually they've embraced procedure to an extent where it's like, well, I can't be held responsible because I wasn't even engaging my brain. I was just being a robot following a procedure, right? They promote that at the lowest level for the employees because they, as the agents, the managers, are again held directly reliable for what their minions do, just like people were before the corporate veil, just like owners are in normal partnerships, things like that, right? And so they have way too many reports, multiple layers way down below them, to actually really have a handle on that, right? And so they're going to instead just put in this labyrinth of procedure that makes it to where it doesn't appear that they're actually responsible for what their employees do. In fact, if possible, they want all of the layers of procedure to be promulgated by the lowest level possible so that they are no longer held responsible for anything below them, and instead are just, only responsible for their personal actions, which they have full control over. And as I've mentioned before, these are not exactly the most exciting of people in general. So it's very easy for them to keep their nose clean and essentially just direct the majority of compensation towards themselves. And so that's where we're at basically, is that it's a situation where uh, the owners of the firm are not responsible for anything, but they do get a cut. The management of the firm is not really responsible for anything, but they do get a cut. And at the end of the day, the worker's not responsible for anything either, and they get the smallest piece of the cut. So it's like, really what this is a sort of organized irresponsibility, is how the modern firm is actually working. And it's the same with the bureaucracies, and a lot of this is, like I said, as above so below, because you have these sort of people thinking about it, packing your firm given enough time, because, well, that's how everything else in the corporate world and in the bureaucratic world works, right? So um, I also mentioned earlier in the video that some of this is a lot like, it's a life cycle thing, in that, once a firm scales, and especially once it gets to a certain age, that this is sort of an inevitability to happen, based on market realities and regulatory and all that kind of stuff. Like I mentioned, you're going to have other people coming in from other corporations where this is already well in play. Uh, a lot of people, they see management and things like that being hired from other firms, and especially firms where this sort of pathology is quite well entrenched. Places like in the software world, IBM, stuff like that, or Oracle, or any number of very large tech firms. Once you start to see the management no longer being promoted from within and they start hiring from outside, you can be pretty sure that that's essentially what's going on, is that they've fully succumbed to this sort of incapacity to take risk and incapacity to remain connected to the customer. And instead, it's more about, we're just going to stop taking risks and not get in trouble and enjoy the gravy train while it lasts, right? So, uh, gotta check my notes here. Oh, anyways, so this is very similar to the way the body ages, and yet another sort of as above, so below. When the body ages, it's actually a function of both histones and methylation of various different genes and so forth. In short, the good genes start actually being suppressed by methylation processes in the body, and the bad genes stop being suppressed, which are usually called adverse transposons. But anyways, the point is, you start to inflame and all kinds of crazy stuff, because it turns out that basically your genetic structure is starting to be hostile to your actual body, and that's the real mechanism by which aging actually happens. Nobody's really sure why that happens at the moment, but they're looking into it, right? And so it's the same sort of feeling with corporate, in that it's like, well, it turns out that it's basically committing suicide. It's apoptosis on a mass scale, with regard to their decision making capabilities being totally neutered by their incapacity to take risk, because, well, advancement is a single elimination ass kissing tournament. Because again, if you can't take risks, that's all that's left, right? So, and you look at when people get old in their own life, they tend to start taking less risks, especially, which is funny with investments. In fact, because you have less time, that means you should take more risks. But that's just generally how things go, because you're trying to cling and hold on. You're afraid of losing what you have, rather than lusting for what you don't, and trying to gain that, right? And so uh, the question is, knowing all this, what do you actually do about it as an employee, as a person who wants to own a business, as a person who manages? So how can you be, if you don't like this situation, what can you do about it, right? And that's sort of the thing, that's the hard part, really, because the only way to prevent this from happening is to keep your organization from needing this hack to scale, right? Because then you're no longer going to have this essentially transmission mechanism, with regard to the ownership not being able to directly control what's going on, right? That sort of severing of actual authority from the responsibility for what happens. And so you'd have to organize your firm essentially to not take advantage of the corporate veil. You'd have to instead be something like a partnership, much like a lot of investment and law firms, or you'd have to uh, make sure that all of your management has enough of an ownership stake that they really feel like they have an actual stake in where the company is going, that they feel like their votes, like say, they feel like they're not necessarily board members, but they feel like their votes actually will make a difference when it comes to deciding corporate issues and governance and all that sort of stuff, right? That they likely have through their various proxies put their own member on the board. Uh, Collectively, all the management is capable of at least having one person on the board, right? That would be at least something, which they don't even have right now. So incentives do matter, and when you have them now being owners, that means that, well, what does this select for? Okay, uh, if you require people to actually be part owners of the business, to actually manage the firm, that selects for a very different thing than these sort of glad handing empty heads that just take no risks. That actually selects for people who know how to make money, which usually means they know how to take risks smartly, which means your whole problem is essentially going to go away. So that's really what it comes down to. You have to incentivize and build an incentive structure with regard to how your firm works to avoid this sort of difficulty. And the question is, how do you then scale, right? Well, I think that's going to be the part that you can't really get over, because at some point you're going to run into the same reason why people instituted the corporate veil in the first place. Because once you get to be a big enough target, once you have a large enough attack surface, there's not actually an answer other than just give up in the current legal environment. Because to be entirely frank, a lot of it is actually manifestly unfair and stacked against business in that regard. And so you just sort of have to ask yourself, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Because, the right thing and the right way to do things is to, yes, take all the responsibility, but enjoy all the authority, because that's sort of how things naturally go. But instead, it turns out, because of the way tax law and regulatory law and the way litigation goes in this country and pretty much everywhere else in the Western world, you're going to have to adopt the traditional corporate model, because anything else just opens you up to such insane liability that it's even worse of a pathology than what happens when you have the state of nature where people are actually on the hook and incentives are correct. Because that now warps the incentives into essentially the management is now living in even greater fear of being crushed by the machine. Now, sometimes this works out and that they're just very disagreeable people, shall we say, and they pretty much they don't respond well to threats, shall we say, and they can keep the business from a point of view of taking risks and making good decisions there quite well, but inevitably the government just crushes them, and that's the end of the business. So it's just a different threat profile, right? So which are you more afraid of? Your business stagnating, or your business being destroyed, crushed, and put out of business because, well, they can, you know? So That's why they do it, because at a certain scale you're going to be very obvious. It's going to be hard to miss you, and the powers that be that have a club and because they can are going to do it. So you have to protect yourself at some point, and that means as a person who wants to have an impact and feel like you're making a difference and stuff like that, that means that you're sort of restricting yourself to a different set of firms than you would have otherwise. What I'm saying here is essentially at corporate, you can't actually put any kind of meaning into what you're doing because it's never going to work out, okay? Because that's just the way the system is. That's just the way it's got to be, right? So you'd have to be in these smaller firms that are partner owned. If you're an employee, that's what you'd have to seek out. If you want to have some real meaning to your work, if you want to have better rewards, all those sorts of things. That's sort of what you've got to go and look out for. And on the other hand, if you want to have a very stable, keep on trucking as long as you never ever make the appearance of having an opinion. Essentially, you have to sort of look a lot like management with regard to being, stuff in your head with older rags if you never want to be fired at a firm. And if that's the life you want, go for it. But at some point, you're going to get tired of it. At some point, you're going to say, is this all there is to life? Is this all there is to my profession? Right. And so you're going to eventually get restless and do something that will get you fired because you take a risk that doesn't work out, or you just express an opinion of any kind, and these things happen, So a lot of people, they think that they can have their cake and eat it too with regard to trying to keep these risks balanced. And I think the latest one that a lot of people work with is they try to use these HR outsourcing firms that do payroll. They do all kinds of stuff like this, right? But they don't understand that, yes, your hostility as a small businessman to all of the regulatory crap, that's a good thing. That's to be expected, and not liking the way HR and corporate works in general. That's a very good sign that your business actually has the right attitude with regard to growing and being a small and startup firm. But at some point, you know, that's just going to infect your company. The attitudes of the people at those firms are as stultified as you could possibly imagine, and they're going to inevitably want more influence over the workers than you're comfortable with giving them. And too bad, because you're already pot committed at that point. And then it's you basically have to go down with that ship. And any kind of hack that you end up finding that you think is going to help you scale is not gonna, because at the end of the day, the reason why people are engaging in these in the first place is because of regulatory threats and because of various different issues that you really can't get around. It's like, so how can I not have liability and not dilute my ownership? Well, there's only one legal, real way to do that, and that means you come along with all of the various different problems that are associated with that. So, um, my advice is when you go against the flow, it does not work out well for you. Okay. And the flow right now, at least in the Western world, is very much not for you to be this independent risk taker, all that sort of stuff. No, it's actually very much on the program, be part of the system, that kind of stuff. It's very much obedience and fear and let's not take risks and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's just the overwhelming zeitgeist is being pushed here in the media and all that stuff in particular. A lot of that's just because, sensationalism is what actually gets the views and so forth. And so it's just we're pressing the fear button all day in journalism. But you have to ask yourself, well, why do people eat that stuff up? Well, it's not for no reason. You know, people can get indignation from other sources. People can get all these things that push emotional buttons from other sources. So why is it that they're pressing this fear button so much? Well, it's because all these people who have fear of loss, that's what pushes their button harder than anybody else. And when you have society and corporate and everybody, that's sort of where their corn pone is at, is exactly right there of, you know, being afraid of loss. Well, that's what you're going to get, you know? So I would say just embrace the hack. Don't go against the flow. This is how things have to work in a system like this. You can't really get around it. And so it's just either you're going to be a small businessman where you can avoid this, but if you want to scale, you don't really have a choice. You're just going to have to put up with it. All right. Well, I hope that was a very uplifting message for you here today. And hopefully, this sort of gets all of my anti corporateness out of my system. I'd say the biggest thing to read here is a book called Moral Mazes. Another one that's good would be called The Suicidal Corporation. But the point is, both of those were put out when I was a baby, you know, and this stuff is not new. This stuff has in fact been going on longer than I have been alive. And you know, that's like I said, this stuff can persist a really long time. In fact, it can persist longer than your lifetime and longer than you can stay solvent. So you're just going to have to accept this is the way things are and move with it and either decide to play ball or go out your own way, because those are the only two options, you know? So like I said, hopefully it's out of my system and I can start talking about other things here on this channel. I think most of what I'm going to be talking about going forward here is going to be some programming streams, stuff like that. I've been getting back into TCMS quite a bit and still busy with contracts. So, hey, I'm happy with that, you know, making money, doing good. And we'll go from there. This is George signing off.